How do you make cinematic shots? Episode 8 in Season 1 of the anime series Chainsaw Man showcases many examples of dynamic cinematic shots, so let's try to break them down. In cinematic shot number 1, we see Denji's foot on screen left in the foreground, and he's slightly out of focus. The camera is placed a little below his foot, looking upward so we see some of the ceiling plane. The focus of the shot is on the back of Himeno as she walks towards the door. So we have a clear foreground with Denji's foot, a midground where Himeno is standing, and a background that can be seen through the doorway. The camera lens could be slightly longer than 50 millimeters, allowing us to see some of the environmental context, but not the overall space. In cinematic shot number 2, the camera is placed high above, looking downward into the bathroom. We see Himeno's reflection in the mirror as she leans against the doorway, which is technically outside the current camera frame. The perspective cues of the mirror and bathroom structural elements tell us that there is a 3-point perspective grid within the shot. Himeno is slightly out of focus in the reflection, possibly suggesting her mental state during this story beat. Chainsaw Man has used reflection of characters in shots as inventive ways to stage characters within the set space. In cinematic shot number 3, the camera is placed inside the fridge, shooting outward toward the door as Himeno opens the door. The Tupperware boxes in the foreground act as good foreground elements to frame the composition, giving us perspective cues to see the spatial depth inside the fridge. And we see that Himeno is approximately in the center of the frame. There's a plate of glass at the top part of the frame that helps us to also see a perspective grid within the shot, directing us toward Himeno's face. There is an overall cool blue tone, suggesting the artificial light inside the fridge. In cinematic shot number 4, the camera cuts in closer to Himeno's face as she lays on the bed facing Denji, who is off camera. The grid of the window behind her is slightly out of focus to help create spatial depth. The bed sheets on the far left of the frame is also slightly blurred at the edges. The camera is essentially being turned on its side and placed on the mattress to give us a sense of how Himeno looks from Denji's point of view. It's a very intimate shot that highlights the tension between them in this scene. In cinematic shot number 5, we see the reverse shot on Denji. The back of Himeno's head is blurred in the foreground, and Denji's face is clearly in focus as the camera captures his reaction to Himeno. Once again, the camera is turned on its side and is being placed near Himeno's head to bring us into a very personal space between Denji and Himeno in the scene. The background elements behind Denji are slightly out of focus to create a sense of spatial depth. Even the edge of the shadow on Denji's face helps us draw our eyes toward his facial expression, especially around his eyes. In cinematic shot number 6, we see a longer camera lens being used to capture this moment between Makima and Denji out in the street. The sign on screen right is out of focus, acting as a foreground element. We can see that the perspective cues of the buildings in the background are relatively compressed together, suggesting the use of a longer camera lens being used. Makima and Denji are clearly in focus, and they're the primary subject of the shot, and they're both staged in profile view. In cinematic shot number 7, we cut to a much wider shot where Makima and Denji are near the center of the frame and toward the bottom of the frame. A longer camera lens is likely being used to compress the space between all of these surrounding buildings, which would mean that the camera would physically be placed very far back from Makima and Denji to achieve the shot in a real-world space. The signs and city lights are soft and have a glow around them, which can be created with camera filters with a real-life camera. Makima and Denji stay in profile view as the perspective cues of the buildings show how far back the space is behind them. In cinematic shot number 8, the camera is inside the apartment, shooting outward and staging Denji and Himeno outside on the patio around a table. The composition of the shot informs us of the environmental context, telling us where we are and raising our curiosity about the conversation happening between Denji and Himeno. One of the window panes is used as a framing element to compose Denji and Himeno in the same visual space. Meanwhile, the kitchen elements on screen left are out of focus, acting as foreground elements to give us a sense of spatial depth. In cinematic shot number 9, the camera is technically an over-the-shoulder shot, staged behind Himeno, who is out of focus. The camera focuses on Denji, who appears farther back from the camera lens in the midground. Proportionally, Denji is smaller within the frame than Himeno, which may also suggest the power dynamics between the characters within the scene. We also see background elements behind Denji, suggesting more of the spatial context on the balcony. In cinematic shot number 10, we see another interesting camera placement where the camera is placed very close to the screen doors, shooting past a row of potted plants and focusing on Denji and Himeno, who are at the table near the center of the frame. The perspective cues of the screen door and the potted plants tell us that there's a slight 3-point perspective grid within the shot. Also, the tones are darker in the foreground elements compared to the midground and background of the shot, which are in lighter tones. This tonal difference can also be useful in creating a cinematic look. In cinematic shot number 11, the camera is placed left of Himeno, who is off screen, and frames Denji as the focus of the shot, but he's located toward the lower screen right of the frame. We see more of the balcony and patio space on screen left, and also slightly blurred building elements in the background on screen right. The framing of the shot helps keep Denji smaller proportionally within the camera frame, which may suggest how Himeno sees him, or his less dominant presence in the scene compared to her. In cinematic shot number 12, we cut back to Himeno, who is now in a side profile view looking toward screen left toward Denji, who is off camera. Interestingly enough, she's also proportionally smaller in this composition with the city backdrop blurred behind her. This could suggest how Himeno feels in the larger state of the world as she converses with Denji. Seeing her in side profile with possibly a longer camera lens creates a different angle to the dialogue scene between the characters. In cinematic shot number 13, the camera moves in closer and is placed a little under the table, pointed upward to Denji as he leans forward on the table. Now, Denji appears more dynamic and forceful in this upshot than compared to previous shots. The strong diagonal of the ceiling cuts across the top of the frame, helping to frame Denji within the shot. The edge of the table and the glass in the foreground are slightly out of focus to create a sense of spatial depth. In cinematic shot number 14, we return to see Denji and Himeno in the same shot, where both of them are facing each other in a side profile view. There's a plant on screen left that is blurred, acting as a foreground element, and the city backdrop is slightly out of focus behind Denji and Himeno. Both characters are posed casually, conveying the sense of familiarity between them. We're seeing both of them in relatively the same proportion, size-wise, within the frame, giving them equal visual weight within the composition. There's some edge light on the back of Denji and Himeno, caused by sunlight, and this also helps to separate them from the background. In cinematic shot number 15, the team eats a meal inside a restaurant, and the camera is placed close to the level of the table. The focus of the shot is on the lonely character near the center of the frame, but who is placed further back in Z space from our team of characters, who are more in the foreground and midground. Power and Aki are slightly blurred out of focus in the foreground. The staging of the camera places us among the team and cues us into their curiosity about the character who is eating alone at another table. The grid pattern formed by the ceiling plane acts as a useful perspective grid within the composition. In cinematic shot number 16, part of Denji's face is placed in the foreground, acting as a blurred out foreground element. Interestingly enough, we can still see that his eye is turned to look off-screen, looking toward the man eating at the table off-screen. Meanwhile, Aki in profile view is placed behind Denji, and we see part of Power's face on the screen left. We get a sense of the arrangement of the characters around the table. We're likely seeing a longer camera lens being used here. Using part of a character's face as a foreground element is an interesting way to create spatial depth, while also conveying a story point, as seen in Denji's eye direction. In cinematic shot number 17, the camera shows us more of the restaurant space, and uses nearby tables and stools as foreground elements. These elements also frame the team and the lone man in different visual space within the frame. This context shot helps us see the overall environment, which is one effective way to help us understand the physical space before some action and movement occur on set. The perspective cues of the windows on screen right and the kitchen counter on screen left also suggest the spatial depth in the composition, along with the tiles on the ground plane. In cinematic shot number 18, the camera captures a dynamic moment where Power punches the lone man. The camera is placed high above them, looking down toward them, capturing the man's facial expression as a way to help sell the action of Power hitting him. We see the ground plane under them, and we also see perspective cues from the wall planks on screen right, helping us to see the three-point perspective grid within the shot. We also see Power's facial expression during her movement, telling us how she feels about the moment. In cinematic shot number 19, Power faces off against another antagonist devil. Blood drips over the camera frame, slightly out of focus, acting as a foreground element. A longer camera lens could be used to compress the space between the devil in the foreground, Power in the midground, and the building debris in the background. The blood in the foreground helps to dramatize the moment, and it contrasts with Power's nonchalant expression as she takes it all in. In cinematic shot number 20, Himeno is contemplating her next action and the cost for her with respect to the ghost devil. The camera is placed above her chest level, tilted upward, framing Himeno in an upshot. Her hand is in the foreground, slightly out of focus, to create a sense of spatial depth. The background building debris is also out of focus. Himeno's eyes are directed toward her hand in the foreground, and the tighter composition of the shot on her helps us to focus on her acting in the moment. In cinematic shot number 21, we see an extreme close-up on Himeno's eye as part of her extended hand appears in the foreground as foreground element, creating a sense of spatial depth. The tighter composition highlights her action and the dramatic choice that she's about to make in order to defeat the antagonist devil. We get a sense of her determination as seen in the acting expression in her eye and eyebrow within the shot. So this composition acts as a punctuation point to the story beat at this moment. So overall, these technical descriptions of each shot helps break down the elements of what makes them cinematic. The language of film, as shown in composition, lens choice, and camera movement, are well executed in this episode to heighten the drama and action.